History is important. Where we come from, who our family is, where we lived, and who our relatives are. That's part of history.
Artifacts, what they have is they contain information about a people, whether it's historic artifacts or prehistoric artifacts of a people and a time and a place, what they did on the landscape. They tell us more about who was there, why they were there, and what were they doing there. We have over 14,000 years of history here in the state, and a lot of that data is only found from the artifacts. Now, what our office does is encourage artifacts to stay in place, to remain in the field. But we all know that when you find something out in the field, the interest is just overwhelming, and people tend to pick it in the pocket and take it home. The problem we have is after that, they get it home and say, what do they do with it? Usually they toss it in the corner, put it in a coffee can, somewhere on your mantelpiece, and when you're plowing the fields, more and more of these show up, and you or your grandkids have been collecting them. You have a whole coffee can full. All you know is a bunch of arrowheads. But really, by looking at those arrowheads, we get a lot of information about the duration, how many thousands of years that people used it, used that area, and for what purposes. There's a lot can be done. And then the tribes, all the tribes have museums or are building museums, and by taking these artifacts back to the tribes, interpreting them and showing them on display, they educate not only their own people about their past, but also us as citizens.
What we have here is an atlatl dart point as opposed to an arrow point from the bow and arrow technology. This this projectile point here would have been mounted on a thicker shaft, an atlatl dart shaft, perhaps 3 to 4 feet long. It would have feathers on it, just like an arrow shaft, but it would have been launched from an atlatl, a throwing board, and basically it would have a long trajectory, perhaps 100 meters or more, and this technology, this change between these two types of points occurred about 2,000 years ago.
One thing we're trying to do is to encourage good stewardship. And then stewardship means you need to recognize your history and then value it. And by interpreting these artifacts for the public in general, that's one way of all of us gaining a value about our past.
Well, artifacts typically are defined as anything that's evidence of cultural use through time. So typically what's encountered in the archaeological record will be lithic artifacts, so arrowheads, scrapers, grinding stones, items for hunting and gathering and processing purposes. A lot of times people do encounter them when they are in the great outdoors, but also they have been items that have been collected in the past, so a lot of times people will encounter them when they're cleaning out their garages, their attics. If they have family members that pass away, sometimes these get inherited down, and a lot of people don't know what to do with these items, and so that's where usually the tribe comes in.
Well, many of us in the tribe are professionals in our field too, hold PhDs or masters from local universities and can speak to the professional as well as the tribal needs for these things. And so we have a professional interest. We want to see these things returned so that we can use them in a professional manner. As well, we feel a responsibility towards our generations to come and generations previous that we gather these things up and properly care for them. In the past, a lot of settlers or pioneers to this area, recent arrivals to this area, had collected lots of arrowheads, lots of stone bowls, obvious stone tools like hand tools, like chopping stones and things like that. Sometimes there may be woodwork. Some people may have petroglyphs or something they flaked off a wall. They may have basketry that they either bought at some point in the past in their family or found or acquired by some means. But a lot of the stuff is passed on. It's inherited by people from their grandparents and great-grandparents over the last 5, 6, 7 generations of settlers that came to this area that collected things from the tribes. And so many people display these things on the walls, they have them on their mantles, they sometimes have big stone bowls in their backyard as centerpieces or part of their display in the backyard or front yards. And so these things are at times sacred and should be returned to the tribe so we can properly care for them, and at times rebury them, because bowls that are broken out in some fashion or broken in half were originally burial items, and they actually are sacred items that need to be reburied. We believe that many of these things, if they're not reburied, carry power and they could hurt people in some way.
Many people don't know what they have. They don't know the kinds of things or artifacts that they may have in their possession. And a lot of times, some of those artifacts came from burials. A lot of times, some of those artifacts consist of human remains. And for the tribes, these kinds of artifacts are very sacred. And for a person to turn these over to the appropriate tribe or state agency is significant. This is why it's important that the tribes get these back, and it's important that the people that have these understand that today, even if they're hundreds or thousands of years old, they're still significant, they're still sacred, and they still have a role in the tribe's way of life.
The important thing is the return of the objects to their associated tribes, that this is a piece of their culture, a piece of their past that is important for them to be able to identify who they are today. I mean, in the same way, if your family's house burned down and then it was rebuilt later on, and a couple found out in the yard, maybe it was tossed out in the fire, a family Bible or some family photographs, or some outbuilding had some family treasures, and your name somehow was written on, or there was some way to identify that they were yours. Wouldn't it be incredibly wonderful if that couple took the time and made the effort to get those items that have incredible value to you and your family back to you?
Under federal law, if you're on federal land or working on a federally funded project, you're not to pick up the artifacts, disturb them in any way, or to follow the proper protocols, which includes stopping the work if it's a ground disturbing project. If it's just found on the surface, leave it where it is and report to the federal land manager, and make sure that the appropriate tribe or tribes are contacted. Under state law, which applies also to private lands, all non-federal lands within the state of Oregon, the law technically states that you can pick up an arrowhead off the surface if you don't have to use anything, even your finger as a tool to uncover it. So if it's just laying there on the surface. But most of the state agencies and tribal organizations, governments, prefer that you leave any artifact found where it is. As soon as you pick it up, it loses its context. It loses lots of valuable information about what else it's related to, and many times information about where it was even found quickly gets lost.
You come to a point where you begin to go, my gosh, there's a ton of stuff right here, a huge story if you know what it is that you're looking at.
On a fairly regular basis, we get phone calls or emails with photos attached of objects, and are asked questions about our thoughts on their origin. Pretty often in family members' estates, there's baskets, there's arrowheads, there's other things that were kept by the family member that nobody else has any information about. And so generally tribes are willing to provide that information and advice on where that object needs to go. If it's something found in a garage, it's best to photograph the object and email those photographs to the Legislative Commission on Indian Services and what you think is the appropriate tribes. And then if there are additional tribes that should be contacted, the Legislative Commission on Indian Services, that's a regular part of their duties, is designating appropriate tribes to be contacted on an issue.
I had a gentleman around 4 years ago out of the Scio area show me a willow leaf shaped point that he found in his garden. And he deliberately stopped me in the middle of the road and he said, 10 feet from where you're standing is where I found this. And from that discovery point and whatever else that he happened to have in a baby food jar was totally full of small little tiny points, that it came out of the same location in a garden space probably maybe 25 or 30 feet wide by 50 feet in length. There were 100 points came out of that area, and we're able to get it recorded as an archaeological site having belonged to the Kalapuya people. When they say it's written in stone, it's there. You just have to be able to read the stone.
Well, if you think you found some cool stuff on your land, I definitely first thing would reassure you that nobody is going to take your land away. You're not going to lose your property rights. What I would like to know is where exactly on your property you did find them, so we can record that information and get a little better idea of what other resources might be located there. But by no means would anybody be trespassing on your property, taking your property away from you. It would just be more informative to help the tribe with our overall picture of tribal resource utilization.
Over the years, a number of people have called me because they've been cleaning out their basement or their attic or moving their elderly parents out of the home that they've been in for generations, and they find some item that they think might be connected with a Native American tribe. We're very lucky in the state of Oregon. For over 36 years, there's been this office, the Legislative Commission on Indian Services, a small office in the state capitol, but it is your go-to place in this situation. Our job is to assist you in making the connections of contacting the appropriate tribal representative. And we appreciate it so much, as do the tribes.